Good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon, based on where you are. I am both excited and extremely grateful to be asked to speak for you all today, and I apologize for not being able to be there in person. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Edward Hertzman, founder and president of Sourcing Journal. While these days I'm most widely associated with my media business, I spent the first decade of my career working in South Asia with brands from all around the world. So my thoughts and my perspectives are someone who has been on the ground and on both sides of the buyer and seller equation. This also allows me a unique vantage point to all the things going on across our industry. As someone in the media, we make a living off of headlines. So the good has to be great and the bad has to be really disastrous. But somewhere in between the extremes we report on a daily basis lies the reality. As someone in the media, and what that reality is can be sometimes hard to pinpoint. But I'll do my best today to share with you what the reality is as I see it. So I was asked to speak today about supply chain in crisis, but in my belief, the topic is more accurately labeled supply chain in transition. Listen, goods are moving, the supply chain is functioning. We, in fact, have too much inventory. That being said, there are a couple of themes we need to address as how we got here. First, we need to stop using pre-pandemic as a reference point. We often talk about a return to normalcy or the new normal, but in my view, that's really just semantics. It's a day-to-day running of our business that matters to all of us. And the fact is 2019 is gone. The cost structure will never be seen again. And is this unusual? Not really. So is 1978. And that price structure is gone. We no longer reference that. So we need to face the facts that container prices, raw material, labor costs, et cetera, are never going to settle at the lows we once enjoyed. The industry I cover most closely is retail. And for close to 10 years, a full decade, prices didn't change at all. And the supply chain are at the register. The pandemic gave all facets of the industry the opportunity to rationalize these costs. Freight went up, energy went up, labor went up, and brands are selling more at full price than ever before. The second and more relevant issue, I believe, is that the way the supply chain was built to function has become outdated. We must not forget we haven't invested in our supply chain on a global level in decades. The same highways, railroads, ports that were moving our merchandise pre-pandemic, same as in the 1980s, are still being relied on today. And it's a tired infrastructure. The pandemic didn't cause these structural problems in the supply chain, but it exposed the weak and frail state and it brought it to its knees. Consumer shopping patterns have changed over time, while our systems to deliver these goods have remained stagnant. Amazon used to deliver books, now represents 51% of all online orders, from paper towels to lampshades. While the existing system somehow was able to handle the shift from physical shopping to delivery, was operating under stress and unable to weather the surge of the 2020s e-commerce boom. But the supply chain issues are so much deeper than just supply and demand. As our consumption patterns changed, so much the back end needed to deliver it. Put simply, no one anticipated when these systems were built that a pink sweater in a warehouse in Cleveland would need to be somehow on someone's doorstep in New Mexico in 24 hours at no added cost. On top of this, we simply don't have the workers or human resources to operate efficiently at this volume. I'm sure many of you remember late last year, President Biden announced that the U.S. West Coast ports would operate 24/7. Prior to this, there were 2 9-hour shifts on the docks on Monday through Friday, with limited work Saturday. For perspective, the ports of Long Beach and LA funnel roughly 40% of all the imports into the U.S. To the uninformed, Biden's announcement seemed like an excellent decision and an initiative sure to make progress in easing congestion. However, those paying close attention knew that this wouldn't do much at all and was largely a joke. 24/7 operating schedules are theoretically great if you get people to work. Well, the result was that the idea was abandoned within 3 months due to lack of employee buy-in. I use this point to explain and to emphasize that what is needed is not brute force or literally manhandling our way through it, but rather a thoughtful re-examining of how we're doing things, what could be changed, and the most efficient way to get there. So what exactly is here? Let me lay it out for you. One, input prices are going up, be it raw materials or energy. All of you in Europe now, how quickly those prices have risen, or labor. So I don't really see these changing anytime soon. And yes, they've come down a little bit though. Container prices may be decreasing, but most are locked into contracts well above the spot prices. So sustained prices at pre-pandemic levels will never return. Even if freight prices find a new normal, once the good hits the soil, everything from rail to trucking to warehousing to returns is more costly. FedEx just increased its prices by 6.9%, the largest hike in history. This too is not temporary. So we will all be dealing with our higher cost of goods. That's a fact. If your strategy remains trying to shave off 5 cents from your factory partner, I believe you've learned little from the pandemic. COVID created a supply issue. So brands overnight dealt with lean inventory and scarcity, which led to sell-through and higher ticket sales, in return, better margin. Instead of learning from this, figuring out how to retool our supply chain to be more responsive, one that limits inventory positions and de-risks a trend-focused business, we collectively did the opposite. We bought as if the good times would never end. From record margin, we are headed to record markdowns. Another point is that geopolitical tension is here to stay. I believe we took for granted years of borderless trade. The days are gone. In less than a year, we saw a war in Ukraine, Ethiopia removed from AGOA, a military junta in Myanmar, presidents assassinated, not to mention what potentially lies ahead between China and Taiwan. How much risk, I asked, does the activewear and technical fabric market have if something was to go south in Taiwan? So what's the solution? First, we must continue to build and sustain diversity in our supply chain matrix. Counter-sourcing and multiple sources of the same product are a must-have. If the pandemic taught us anything, it's that we cannot have a single point of failure. Second, develop strong relationships with your factory partners upstream. I recall many phone calls last year from my factory friends asking me, should they take order X or order Y? They were wondering how it could be possible that order quantities were 30% higher than 2019. Being so far away from the States, they asked, is it really going that well over there? The bigger question is, what choice do they really have? Take the order and potentially get burnt if they end up being canceled or the payment renegotiated, or don't take it and have no business at all. They all took the orders, and I'm guessing you probably would have too. But how did that turn out? In order to accommodate such growth, many factories hired more staff, they expanded their lines, took bigger positions in raw materials and inputs, all of which had to be procured at higher prices. And as soon as the demand dried up, orders were canceled, payments deferred, shipments postponed. Everything the factories feared, they were right to be weary. I spoke out publicly in multiple forums, cautioning against this overly bullish behavior. I called it like I see it. In this case, I blatantly labeled it fool's gold. When the money is flowing through the registers and the stock prices are at a record high and the bonuses are rich, I'm just a naysayer, a pessimist screaming into the wind. But I wasn't trying to be a contrarian to incite fear. I know what it's like running a business. I know what it's like being on the ground. I was attempting to preach caution in the face of what I saw was coming and coming hard, a rationalization of demand. And I wasn't being negative just to be negative, but I do consider myself a realist. And I'm not sitting here today to congratulate myself on a correct forecast, but the bloated margins and strong demand we saw throughout most of 2021 was simply unsustainable. But did the industry agree? Let me make my case with some cold, hard data. As you will see, my warnings were indeed not heeded. In the first 6 months of this year, in the US, We imported 24% more units of apparel from January to June. That's the textile data. Thanks to inflation, that equates to 40% more in dollar amounts. And this is on the heels of a 25% increase in volume in 2020. I ask, how could a mature economy like the United States absorb 24% more units of fashion and apparel coming off of a record year? The stimulus is gone. People could resume eating out, going to work, traveling. Somehow, collectively, as an industry, we thought this was wise behavior because this wasn't a one retailer story, but largely a collective mindset. Retail executives from all verticals and all sizes expected this growth coming in at decade level highs to continue at this robust pace. And this truly amazes me. But on the heels of a pandemic, with a war going on, inflation raging, it would have seemed to me that an ounce of prudence was called for. Instead, we now find ourselves vastly over inventoried, margins are getting slashed, cost cutting and headcount reductions are everywhere. And the painful part, when the next boom comes, we're going to do it all over again. It's a familiar saying that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a definition of insanity. I apologize, but to be so blunt, I think everyone in this industry is freaking crazy. We once again, since this far too familiar story, excess inventory, markdowns, margin erosion, and reduced forecasts. We need to stop this. We need to manage our businesses better, more thoughtfully. We can no longer be so myopic. We have to stop thinking so short term. We have to stop measuring success in months or quarters. We have to play the long game. To your surprise, I don't think the fundamentals are as bad as many others do. The issue isn't whether we are technically in a recession or heading into one or coming out of one. As long as the headlines I mentioned earlier remain negative, so will consumer sentiment and their spending will follow suit. We must steel ourselves for difficult days ahead. However, not by being overly cautious to counterbalance our buoyant past, but by being strategic about the decisions we make to preserve the foundations we have built. Let me be frank, holiday will not be good. Margins will be eroded and next year will be mediocre if we are lucky. But yet, taking the long view, I am optimistic. Once we can accept these realities and the cyclical nature of it all, we can go back to being resilient and prepare ourselves for the future. We can build lasting enterprises on a solid, tried and true foundations, the way we once did, companies that lasted for generations. This is a cycle I'm in full support of. Now that I said my piece on that, let me get to a few final issues that I think are crucial. Let me ask you this. Is sustainability important? Well, I believe that's a trick question. It doesn't matter how you answer it. I just don't care what surveys say, what Gen Z thinks, how the boomer generation weighs in. This is all irrelevant. And why? Because we need to stop debating if sustainability is important and start accepting the fact that we will all be regulated and forced to comply to a new standard of business, one that few can adhere to today. Greenwashing, I say stop. Fancy claims in an ESG report, stop. Start future-proofing your supply chain. Traceability, call it the new black. Do you know where your cotton comes from? Great, so you say, but can you prove it? I know that putting these systems in place are expensive, but so is losing a shipment to customs or being unable to sell in certain provinces. Yes, at the same time, human capital, monetary capital requirements are substantial, but trust me, you no longer have a choice. I ask you to ask yourself these simple questions. Can you measure your 2030 goals? And are they really attainable? How many of you work with Blue Sign or a similar organization? How many of you could trace the origin of your cotton? Can you honestly all say your factory partners are paying attention or paying their workers above board? You may know your tier 1 suppliers, but can you say the same for your tier 2 and tier 3? How do we get companies to make sustainability more important than just a capsule collection, a change in messaging, or a well-illustrated ESG report? To me, there are only two ways to get people to change behavior, two levers that can be pulled. Either you change the incentive structure for which executives and companies get rewarded, or you threaten those who don't change with punitive consequences, i.e. regulation. The latter seems a lot more likely, and trust me, it's already happening. This regulation will not only force companies to take sustainability more seriously, it will also keep everyone kosher. Since its inception, sustainability has been a self-regulating sport. Is it working? My question for our industry is, who is scoring the sustainability claims? Who is signing the scorecard at the end of the round? Everyone is laying out their plans for 2025, 2030, but is anyone really accountable? What is the penalty or the consequences if these goals are not met? And the question is there one? Do you just say, well, we'll try harder? It makes me think of all my New Year resolutions. They all look fantastic on paper, but I fail to come through. There's no audit committee or government agency around to make sure I'm going to the gym. And when it comes to sourcing, what is the best strategy? My answer to that is there isn't just one. Not all sourcing is the same, not all products. Fashion may require near sourcing, low units, higher costs, air freight. It sounds expensive if you only look at FOB, but missing a trend equates to lost sales. A wrong buy, but a small buy, is correctable. Waiting 9 months and taking a lot of inventory and polka dot widgets is catastrophic. Our problems are bigger than an increased returns or higher rail costs. It's the metrics by which we judge our industry, which in turn creates unhealthy behavior and breeds the boom and bust cycle we have become far too accustomed to. So many of you, I may be stating the obvious, or perhaps I identified some headwinds you may have already considered. But you cannot react to these pressures in a short-sighted, myopic way. No one has cut their way to success. We need long-term plans. Let's not milk profit for profit's sake next quarter. We like to think each of our companies are truly unique, but we act with a herd mentality. It's time for us to use that in our favor, collaborate, work together to find solutions and change the way the industry thinks about success. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Any questions for Eddie? I do have a question, Eddie. Just a couple of weeks back, we were at another conference where we were informed one of the leaders.
It's hard for me to hear you right now.
Hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
Perfect. So a couple of weeks back, we were at another conference and we were informed that some of the leading brands from Europe have enough stock that they are not ordering any stock for the next year. They're going to keep whatever they've ordered in 2021, 2022 in the warehouse and then repurpose it and like sell it in 2023 and 2024. So there are no new orders going out for the next 18 months. Are you seeing this sort of, have you heard this sort of a trend in the US? Any brands are considering that?
So in speaking to, well, let me say this. In speaking to all the factory partners and agents and virtual manufacturers that I know, I would say on average, order bookings for Q1 2023 are down anywhere from 30 to 40%. And in certain categories, which like home, which had, is probably seeing a more increased decline, it could be 40 to 50%. So I think the reason the orders are down 30, 40% are for two reasons. One, people are trying to rationalize demand. And two, to your point, orders did come in late. If a boot company received their boots, not in October, but in March, a lot of them, pack and held that, and they're bringing it back out this year. So I think a combination of decreased demand, rationalization of demand, and pack and hold, collectively, these factories are seeing a pretty substantial decline in order bookings for the first half of this year, which is going to cause a lot of pain at the factory level.
And this morning, we talked about, yesterday in the evening, we talked about the nearshoring and reshoring concepts. I know a lot of brands in the US are considering that. There have been pilot projects that have been set up. Some have succeeded, some haven't, unfortunately. But because you've been in the industry for so long, and specifically with brands in the sourcing sector, what's your perception? How long do you think it will take? Like, will there come a point where, say, 40%, 50% of the manufacturing will not happen in China and it'll come back to Central America or America? Like, what's your timeline as per you on that?
So there's two things we have to consider. The first point is absolutely there is an increased demand and desire to be closer to home. And again, it's in looking at the statistics, and more importantly, in speaking to the factories that I know in Mexico and Colombia and Peru, they have seen their bookings increase. In fact, a lot of times when I call them at saying, hey, I have a brand or retailer that's interested in working with you, they say they're at full capacity. So they're having to invest in infrastructure and try to expand capacity to meet the demand. What we have to remember is there's only so much capacity though in this region. So if you take Peru, you take all of Central America, Latin America, you add it all up and you square it, still it's not enough capacity to even take a marginal percentage of the work being done in a place like China. China, I think, is going to continue to see a decrease in imports, especially with, you want to call it a Cold War or whatever US-China tension there is. But I think that for certain categories, whether it be like something like footwear, there's only so many places you can go. So it's really China, Vietnam, a little bit of Mexico, a little bit of Portugal, Brazil. So I think we have to look category by category. I don't think it's a lack of desire. I think, like I said, there's a capacity issue. I think the pricing constraints that kept people out of the Americas, when you incorporate, when you add the duty-free options, you talk about the reduced logistical cost. But more importantly, I think what's bringing people closer to home is the idea that, and if you look at the business models of the Sheins of the world, and of course the Zaras, you need to be able to react instantly to trend. And so if you're working with a factory close to home, and you have a good relationship with them where you procure the grays and you have the fabric, you could cut a trend and get it into your stores or on your website in weeks or even days, when if you're working in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, this could take months. So I think that the need for speed is causing people to really relook where they're manufacturing. I can't tell you that we're going to see 50% return back to home, because as I said, we just don't have the capacity to handle that. But I think people are going to be moving more and more back here.
And do you have any numbers or any guess estimates that you can make on-demand manufacturing in general in the US?
On demand?
On demand, yeah.
I don't have any stats, because I don't want to give any wrong numbers. But I think what's interesting is that there are companies that are popping up that are making on-demand products. Some of them are making the products in China or elsewhere. And what's very interesting is that the consumers are willing to wait. When I asked them, I said, come on, I'm going to play something and I have to wait 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that I don't think the whole industry is going to be able to be on demand, but I think there is a growing consciousness for a more sustainable future, for reduction in waste. And also people love the idea of personalization and being part of the design process. So there is a certain percentage of brands. I see even over here on Fifth Avenue, people walking into Nike Town, designing their shoes. So I think this is a part of the business that people should explore more. Going back to the couture in the luxury space, all of this was on demand, really. It's not a new concept. But I don't think this is going to represent 100% of manufacturing. But I do think that companies need to consider a portion of their business to be on demand, because it will reduce risk, it will reduce returns, you could sell at a higher margin, and I just think it represents a new way of manufacturing. So I do think we're going to see more of this in the years ahead.
Thanks, Eddie. Any questions from the audience? All right. Thanks, Eddie. Thanks for your time this morning. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.